One of Thomas Aquinas' most important contributions to the ongoing current of Western thought was his adaptation of Aristotelian thought, and especially of Aristotelian philosophical method, to the needs of the Christian philosophy and theology of Thomas's time. This appears clearly in six aspects of the Aristotelian legacy that Aquinas adopted and made integral to his own system: logic, epistemology, teleology, motion, politics, and legal thinking. Some understanding of Thomas's social background and institutional context, the Dominican order, and the discourse of the university of his time help us grasp Aquinas' significance for his own time and for ours. Aquinas, who was born probably in 1225 and died certainly in 1274 on the 7th of March of that year, was the son of a South Italian noble house, very well connected to the ruling dynasty of the Kingdom of Sicily and to the international European aristocracy of 13th century Western Europe. There's even a claim that Thomas was a kind of grandnephew of the emperor, although that may be an exaggerated genealogical claim. In any event, his family was extremely well connected in the world of his own age. More significantly than his social contacts are his education and his institutional networking. He was the child of the new university system, which had emerged at Bologna, at Paris, and at Oxford in the second half of the 12th century, and then began to produce its own offspring. The university was designed to train professionals, and train professionals it did. And one of the most consummate professionals it ever produced was Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas was also the star of the even newer Dominican order, founded in the first decade, or finally approved by the Pope in the first decade of the 13th century. This was a pan-European elite order of friars, indeed more than pan-European. A little bit after Thomas's own lifetime, there would be a Dominican Archbishop of Peking. And during Thomas's lifetime, there were 16 provinces into which the Dominican order was organized, stretching all the way from Morocco to China. This remarkable order was dedicated very single-mindedly to the strengthening and extension of their vision of Christian orthodoxy. Aquinas was educated at several different places. First of all, at the venerable Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino, near his own birthplace, south of Rome. Thomas was born and grew up in a remarkable valley, a part of the Roman Campagna, or the Italian Campagna, which had been home to Cicero, to Marius, the final adult home of Benedict, the founder of the Benedictine order, and finally to Aquinas himself. Then he was sent from Monte Cassino, where he was raised up as a child from about age 5 to his teens. He was sent to the University of Naples, which had been founded in 1224 by his kinsman, the King Frederick II. Frederick II was king of the Kingdom of Sicily, which meant in those days not simply the island of Sicily, but also the southern 1/3 or really 40% of the Italian peninsula. There, at the University of Naples, Thomas achieved what we might say was his BA, or his AB, his Artium Baccalaureatus, as they would have put it, which was the basic study of the 7 liberal arts. Probably the most important course that Thomas took there, most important in terms of the curricular offerings of the time, as well as most important in terms of its long-range impact, was a course on Aristotle, which was taught by a remarkable cleric, a Christian priest, who taught Aristotle according to the interpretation of the Muslim teacher Averroes of Cordova. Averroes is a very dangerous kind of man. He was declared a heretic by his own Muslim faith as well as by most Christians for a number of reasons. But the most dangerous of Averroes' doctrines, which he drew directly from his understanding of Aristotle, was the doctrine of the non-immortality of the soul, the immortality of the individual soul, one of the most fundamentally important doctrines for Islam and for Christianity and for rabbinical Judaism. Was a doctrine which Aristotle might or might not have supported. Aristotle's own comments on what happened to the human soul after the human body decayed are ambiguous. We don't really know what to make of them. Averroes interpreted them in a way which led to the very clear conclusion that the human person died with the death of the body, that there was nothing in the way of a personal afterlife. Part of the soul's component might go back to join a great reservoir of spirit, of active intellect in the world, but your individual personality disappeared. This is a profoundly dangerous doctrine, striking at the very root of Muslim and Christian and rabbinical Jewish belief. After that, Thomas went to the University of Paris, where he got what we would call his MA degree and his STD, his Doctorate of Sacred Theology, which he did at a remarkably young age. He taught thereafter at Paris, also at the itinerant Papal University in Italy, which did not stay in Rome. It moved around with the Pope and the Papal Curia to the different cities of Italy where the Pope and the Curia were, not because the Pope and the Curia didn't like Rome, but because Rome was already, in the 13th century, a very dangerous place because of malaria, as well as because of the possibilities of political coup. Finally, Thomas taught at the University of Naples, where he had been trained. And he died at the age of 49 on the 7th of March in the year 1274. By then, the author of some either 60 to 100 titles, but depending how different editors have combined and separated the many works he composed. The author of many, many volumes, even thick volumes in very thin Bible paper. Let's take a look at Aquinas' Aristotelianism, which was central to his own contributions to philosophy and to theology. Aquinas was, among other things, the last creative commentator on Aristotle's philosophy. His predecessors in that intellectual activity of respectful but autonomous adaptation were several. There was Alexander of Aphrodisias, Avicenna, Averroes, Aquinas' own teacher Albertus Magnus, and of course Aquinas himself. Interesting that their names should all begin in the Roman alphabet at any rate with the letter A, surely nothing more than an accident. The first of the significant interpreters of Aristotle in this autonomous and independent direction, adapters rather than simply commentators, was one Alexander of Aphrodisias, a Greek who flourished sometime between 198 of the Common Era and 220. We know that he was lecturing on Aristotle at Athens in the Lyceum, the school which Aristotle himself had founded between 198 CE and 211. And he seems to have been around at Athens for another 10 years or so, after which we lose track of him. Now, Alexander is a very good example of the kind of Aristotelianism we're talking about today. He eloquently defended Aristotelian logic, which had been under attack by Stoics, to some extent by Epicureans, certainly by skeptics, ever since a generation after Aristotle's own death in 322 BCE. And at the very moment that Alexander of Aphrodisias is strongly defending Aristotelian logic, it is under serious attack by the second wave of skeptical thinking led by one Sextus Empiricus teaching at Rome. Alexander was quite independent, though. Instead of following Aristotle on the question of universals towards the doctrine which we call moderate realism, Alexander was a nominalist. He also denied the immortality of the soul, as would the later commentator Averroes. So what we have here is a person who is a deep admirer of Aristotle and who uses Aristotle, but who is not slavishly obedient to what Aristotle teaches. 8 centuries later or so, there arose in the city of Bukhara in Central Asia, that brilliant oasis of culture in the middle of the deserts, which are today Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and so on, that great corridor between the world of high Chinese culture and the world of high West Asian culture. A man known as Ibn Sina, more complicated name than that, but he was the son of one Sina, and that Arabic name was deformed into the Latin word Avicenna, the Latin name Avicenna, as he was most widely known in the medieval West, and indeed is most conveniently described today, conveniently called today at any rate. He seems to have been born around the year CE 980, and he died in 1037. Ibn Sina tried to combine lots of Neoplatonic doctrine with Aristotelian doctrine, and he was particularly interested in Aristotle's physical doctrines, especially his teachings regarding zoology, especially human zoology. Avicenna interpreted Aristotle's medical thought, put it together, compiled into a great work known as the Kulliyat, which would be taught in Western universities, of course in Latin translation, through the 17th century. This is the last time that Aristotle remained a sort of vital force in the creation of new thought in the Western tradition. After Ibn Sina, in the Muslim Aristotelian tradition, came the great Ibn Rushd, the son of Rushd. In fact, he has a remarkably dramatic name, of about 6 or 7 different names, Mohammed ibn Ahmar ibn Ali, etc., ibn Rushd, whose name was deformed into the Latin Averroes. Born in Cordoba, in Spain, of a very aristocratic Hispano-Arabic family in the year 1126, and dying in 1198, Averroes had a remarkable career. First of all, as a lawyer of Islamic law, who then became an advisor to various sultans, Almohad rulers of Spain, who protected him from the worst consequences of his extremely radical doctrines, in which he rejected much of Muslim orthodoxy in favor of what he saw as Aristotelian truth, especially as regards the immortality of the soul. He was independent enough also, in commenting on Aristotle, to dismiss Aristotle's great book on politics in favor of Plato's Republic. In the long series of his commentaries on Aristotle, he leaves out the politics and substitutes for it his own interpretation of the Republic. There, he does something really quite wonderful and typical of the kind of creative Aristotelianism we're talking about today. He decides that the philosopher king proposed by Plato, simply dismissed by Aristotle, not even mentioned, is represented in his own time by the Imam, the supremely enlightened leader of Islam, who's an important feature of Islamic political thought. Now, Aquinas' own teacher at Paris and then at Cologne was Albert the Great German naturalist who interpreted much of Aristotle's doctrine, passing on what Aristotle taught in logic, for example, but very much questioning Aristotle's natural science, especially his biology. He was very skeptical of various things which Aristotle asserted about the origin of different species, and he set out to do practically experiments and to get his students to go to work on testing out Aristotle's claims, which can be seen, I think, as the beginning of empirical experimentation in the Western scientific tradition. Some of this may have been done by the ancient Greeks, some of it was done by the ancient Greeks, but that had been forgotten. It's revived in the early 13th century by Albert the Great, who passes on to Thomas Aquinas his own understanding of Aristotle. Well, these are the great creative Aristotelians. Soon their line died out. The last blow to this kind of independent Aristotelian thought was delivered by the great Pietro Pomponazzi, a great scholar of the Renaissance tradition of text editing, who was professor at the University of Padua, born in 1462, dying in 1525. And what Pomponazzi strove to do was to restore integral Aristotelianism, Aristotle as he understood himself, as he was understood by his own 4th century Greek contemporaries. And I think Pomponazzi succeeded in doing that, but once he did, then Aristotle died as a source of fresh philosophical creativity. He becomes an appropriate topic, an appropriate subject for philosophical history rather than for philosophical creation. Now, some of the key instances of Aquinas' creatively critical Aristotelianism are, first of all, his teaching regarding the eternity of the world. Aristotle was convinced that the world was eternal. No Christian could adhere to that doctrine and remain a Christian because the Bible says very clearly, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, etc. The Hebrew vision of the origin of the cosmos is a vision of an interventionist God who begins time and begins the universe at a certain point and presumably will end it rather similarly, as opposed to the Greek vision of a universe which has always been there. Very difficult nut for Thomas, the serious Christian and the serious Aristotelian, to crack. And he did it by applying Aristotle's own logic to Aristotle's doctrine of the eternity of the world. And he concluded that Aristotle didn't do as good a job in defending his conviction that the world was eternal as he might have. As a matter of fact, said Aquinas, logic could prove neither the world's eternity nor the contrary of it. The Bible provides the necessary authoritative information on that point. Aristotle didn't prove his point about the eternity of the world. He simply delivered his opinion as an authority, but the opinion of God in the Bible is, of course, of greater significance to Aquinas. Kind of similar was Aquinas' teaching on the nature of the human being. The soul, for Aquinas, is the form of the body. That was Aristotle's doctrine. It's called hylomorphism. There are several kinds of hylomorphism, but this is Aristotle's. The function of the soul is to inform, to be the form, to give not simply shape but purpose and direction to the human body, which interested Aristotle very much. Plato, by contrast, had thought that the soul was linked to the body in a funny kind of relationship, an imprisonment. that the soul was sort of the prisoner of the body, eager to escape from these chains as soon as it could. Aristotle, on the other hand, believed very much in the importance of the body and sense data, and he saw the soul's importance as being the informing principle of the body, the informing principle of the whole human being, really, informing and shaping the body and giving it direction. The great question was, what happened to the soul when the body died? Alexander of Aphrodisias, Averroes of Cordova had decided that the individual person died too, the soul died as well. Thomas, of course, had to reject this opinion, and he did so by a very close examination of Aristotle's teaching, and by a very close examination of the Platonic tradition, especially as expressed by St. Augustine. Remarkably, taking not simply elements of these two teachings, but really taking the structures of Aristotelian thought and of Neoplatonic, Augustinian thought, he managed to put them together and to create a whole new anthropology, which really has more to do with 20th century perceptions of biblical anthropology, and indeed with 20th century existentialism, than it does with Aristotelianism. It is closer to the Christian Aristotelianism of Augustine than to integral Aristotelianism, but it is certainly deeply motivated by the desire to save Aristotle's notion of the soul as the form of the body. Aquinas accepted Aristotle's logical thought integrally and uncritically, even when he disagreed with Aristotle, as in the questions of the eternity of the world and the immortality of the soul. He did so by criticizing Aristotle's conclusions with Aristotle's own logic. Aquinas also followed Aristotle's epistemology. What we know from data collected by the senses is, of course, central, and the determining kind of knowledge that we have. In regard to the human soul, however, Aquinas taught that its function was to learn truths of a spiritual nature as well as material sense knowledge, and as such the human soul survives the death of the body because its fundamental function is, epistemologically speaking, in regard to knowledge gathering, in other words, spiritual. Following Aristotle, again, Aquinas' thought was resolutely teleological, that is, concerned to establish the end or purpose of any being or any of its actions. Thomas expressed this teleological reasoning in his thought on biology, ethics, politics, and cosmology, as well as theology. And there's a very charming story about Thomas Aquinas, who liked to study and teach and didn't want to waste time very much in social encounters, being pursued by a great nobleman whose wealth was so great and whose desire to meet Thomas was so powerful that Thomas's superior in the Dominican house in Paris said, "Please, for the good of the order, if not for yourself, please talk to this man." And the story is that Thomas and this duke walked down from the Mount St. Genevieve, where the university was located, where the Dominican house was, down the Rue Saint-Jacques, the street of Santiago, where the Santiago pilgrimage began, the old Roman road, down to the River Seine, to the place still now called the Quai aux Fleurs, where you can buy flowers and birds in cages and so on. And he said to this great gentleman, "You say you wish to do something for me. Well, then you can buy all the birds." The Duke was delighted and, of course, sent his agents who bought all the birds and built up this huge pile of bird cages in front of Thomas. And Thomas then said, "Open the doors." And the birds all flew out, to the horror of the merchants, of course, and the surprise of the Duke. But nothing could have been a more teleological reaction. Why is a bird? A bird is to fly. To keep a bird from flying is to commit an offense against nature of a very grave kind. Aristotle's doctrine of motion was used by Aquinas in developing proofs for the existence of God. His great Summa Theologiae, sometimes called his Summa Theologica, that enormous book in 3 great parts, usually occupying something like 5 vast volumes of very thin paper, has in part 1, in question 2, 5 proofs of the existence of God. They occur actually in the 3rd article of the 2nd question of the 1st part of the Summa Theologica. Thomas was even more systematic than his master Aristotle. And these proofs are quite familiar to people who have gone to church schools in the West and to people who have taken basic courses criticizing this kind of philosophy. Of those 5 proofs, 2, the proof from motion and the proof from contingency or necessity of being, depend very much on Aristotle's doctrine of motion. Now, it's important to recognize that for Aristotle, motion involved not merely physical movement, but the reduction of potency to act, the movement of a potentiality towards actuality. Thus, the operation of the entire universe is explained by motion, a causal motion, which has a purpose, a point, and a direction, and which often involves the physical moving of one physical thing from one place to another, but not necessarily so, nor even very importantly so. In political philosophy, Aquinas followed Aristotle quite closely, though, again, not in every matter. For Aquinas, as for Aristotle, the state was natural to the human condition. It was not a punitive consequence of original sin, as Augustine and most Western Christians thinkers since him had maintained. For Aquinas, as for Aristotle, the human being is a political animal who needs civil society to reach fulfillment, to reach his own teleological end. The state is thus entirely natural. If one follows Augustine, one would come to the conclusion that the state and schools and the church are all consequences of original sin. We would not need any such institutions if our forebears, Adam and Eve, had not profoundly messed up in the Garden of Eden. Instead, Thomas sees the state, civil society, as one of the noblest fulfillments of the human condition, arising from everything that one can recognize as natural to it. Like Aristotle, Aquinas considered mixed government the best form of government, that is, a mixed combination of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. He favored monarchy more than Aristotle had. Some have argued that Aquinas did this because he was attached to the papal theocracy. On the other hand, we should notice that Aquinas considered democracy, somewhat tempered by aristocracy, but with no element of monarchy in it, the best kind of government for the city-states of his contemporary Italy, the kind of government teleologically most appropriate for them. This is interesting because most of those city-states resembled in many regards, I think you might say in almost every important regard, the ideal polis of Aristotle, the ideal city-state which he described so clearly in his Politics, a community of at most 50,000 citizens with a mixed government and so on. So Thomas will follow out the basic insights of Aristotle, but not always the precise prescription. In his distinctive doctrine of law, Aquinas combined the main lines of Aristotle's Politics with the Stoic doctrine of natural law and added some original features. According to Aquinas, there are 4 or maybe 5 major kinds of law. There's the eternal law of God and his created universe. Scientific law is a part of that. There is also the natural law inherent in human nature. There's divine positive law, specifically legislated for human conduct in, for example, the legal regulations of the Hebrew Scripture and the precepts of the church and canon law in Thomas's own time. These are 3 kinds of divine law: the eternal law, the natural law, and divine positive law. There's also human positive law, law legislated by human legislators. And there is also human custom, which is sort of a law in itself if it is not in conflict with the natural law. Crucial to Thomas's sense of law is the awareness that no divine law could possibly be in conflict with natural law. They both come from the same supreme legislator, God. And any human statute or custom that's inconsistent with natural law has no force. It is not a real law at all because it does not conform to the human teleology. There was, even in his own lifetime, a strong negative reaction to Aquinas' most Aristotelian teachings and even to his Aristotelianism of any kind. This reaction was turned into a movement to condemn Thomism as a heresy. Thomism was the term applied in Thomas's own lifetime to the body of his teachings, which was defined really by its Aristotelian premises. The leading thinkers of the Dominican order's main rival, the Franciscan order, led this movement of condemnation. It got as far as inspiring a bishop of Paris and 2 archbishops of Canterbury, one of them a Dominican as well as one of them a Franciscan, to condemn various of Aquinas' teachings, eventually declaring some of them formal heresies. And therefore, I suppose, by extension, though few people actually went so far as to say this, declared Thomas Aquinas himself a heretic because he was so Aristotelian. The Dominican order, most of it, reacted with gusto, leading to Thomas Aquinas' canonization as a saint of the Catholic Church by Pope John the 22nd in the year 1323. There was ferocious argument about this. Just after the first condemnation of 219 propositions then taught at the University of Paris by Etienne Tempier, the Bishop of Paris, who was neither a Franciscan nor a Dominican, in the year 1277. The Dominican order, in its annual meeting, which was always occurred at one or another place in Europe, defended those positions of the 219 which had been taught by Thomas, quite a number of them, as a matter of fact. But Just a few weeks after the condemnation, the Archbishop of Canterbury declared that that body of propositions, and with specific emphasis on Thomas's, were wrong, were inappropriate. And then in 1284, 7 years later, declared some of them actually heretical. This same Archbishop also offered the faculty of the University of Oxford special indulgences, papal indulgences, for not teaching any of these propositions of Thomas and related Aristotelians. The Oxford faculty accepted some of this offer and declined some of it as well, so independent were the universities in their own time. The suspicious thing about the careful look at the dates of these different condemnations is that they reveal a necessary coordination of plan on the part of Franciscans and some Dominican allies in France and England at least. The papacy held back from that. And in 1323, Pope John the 22nd declared Thomas Aquinas a saint and applied to him the epithet Doctor Communis, the common doctor, whose doctrine should be common to all the Christian theology faculties in the world. That was simply a pious opinion on the part of the Pope, which had no impact whatever on university teaching. Actually, by 1323, Aristotle's logic was under serious critique from the nominalist left, a group of young scholars who deeply questioned Aristotle as well as Thomas on the basis of logical premises, and who would carry the field for quite some time. In later centuries, though, Thomism was vigorously revived. Even if Thomist Aristotelianism was less of a success in its own time than we might expect, it turned out to be a very durable school, which would ultimately achieve remarkable recognition. In the year 1879, Pope Leo XIII, one of the most radical thinkers of the modern papacy, then a man who developed a sort of Christian doctrine of social justice, if not exactly of social revolution, the man who tried to find a third way between Marxism and capitalism, issued a papal bull called Aeterni Patris, which praised Aquinas as the common doctor of all Catholic thinkers, that good 14th century idea, and urged all Catholic professors and universities to revive Thomism, as indeed occurred. Now, Neo-Thomism, as this tradition is generally called, flourished for roughly a century. In Germany and France, in Italy, and then later on in Britain and in the Americas and elsewhere throughout the Western world, with some important contributions from the faculty of the University of Manila, for example. And indeed, Japanese universities have made significant contributions to Neo-Thomist doctrine. But then this doctrine began, or this tradition, this tendency, began to lose appeal even in Catholic academic circles. And this led to a general dismissal of Thomistic teaching in Catholic universities, which, some of you may be aware, the present papacy is trying to reverse. There's a doctrine called Ex Corde Ecclesiae, a document called Ex Corde Ecclesiae, which has recently been assented to by the American bishops, which urges all Catholic universities to hew to the core of Catholic orthodoxy, at least in the teaching of philosophy and theology. And of course, partly stated, largely unstated in this, is the desire to revive Thomism as well as to revive Christian Aristotelianism. Right now, at the very end of the 20th century, there has occurred, not from the bosom of the papacy, not from the circle of John Paul II and Cardinal Ratzinger, who is his right hand in doctrinal matters, but from deconstructionist thinkers, few of whom profess any kind of religious identity themselves, to create what we might call a neo-Thomism, a philosophical movement regarding recasting Thomism and Neo-Thomism in the light of such thinkers as Michel Foucault and Jacques Lacan. Basically, though, I think we have to see that in this new unchurched Neo-Thomist movement, in the Neo-Thomism of the century after Leo XIII, in the Thomism of the medieval universities, we have to see a fundamental commitment for the thought of Aristotle, whom Thomas Aquinas called the philosopher. It's interesting to see the way in which in his enormous body of writing certain epithets occur. Epithets which are little features of style. Anything which is a feature of style in Thomas Aquinas is noteworthy because he strove for a style that was without style, a style that was absolutely scientifically pure, which was even more avoiding of lyrical flourishes than Aristotle's style himself. And this particular style, when it breaks a little bit and when we're allowed to have a sign of particular preference, that sign is very powerful. Thomas speaks of Paul, of course, as the apostle. He speaks of Moses Maimonides the great Jewish Aristotelian, also of the city of Cordova, like Averroes, as Rabbi Moses. He speaks of Averroes as the commentator, though indeed there were many commentators on Aristotle as well as on other philosophers. But whenever he speaks of Aristotle, he refers to him simply as the philosopher. Not so for Plato, not so for Augustine. It was for this pagan worshipper of very impersonal and distant gods that Aquinas reserved the supreme philosophical compliment.